Well, I'm really delighted to welcome everyone here to an event on behalf of the UCLA Alan D. Leve Center for Jewish Studies. And I'd like to welcome you today's event, our speaker, Susan Ackerman, who will be speaking on mothers and rituals of child naming in ancient Israel. This event is part of the Bible in Ancient World seminar series that is co-sponsored by the Leve Center, the UCLA Department of Near Eastern Languages and Cultures, and the UCLA Center for the Study of Religion. And we all want to thank you for being socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these kind of virtual events. Today, we're really fortunate to have Professor Susan Ackerman. I've known Professor Ackerman for many, many years. Boy, that just dates us both, doesn't it, Professor Ackerman? But she is, I believe, one of the premier biblical scholars of her generation, and she is a Hebrew Bible scholar and currently holds the Preston H. Kelsey Professor of Religion chair at Dartmouth College. She's also a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies and a professor of Jewish studies at Dartmouth College, where she has taught since 1990. She specializes in the religion of ancient Israel, as well as the religions of Israel's neighbors, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, and especially women's religious history. She studied at Dartmouth, where she teaches now, and then she did her PhD at Harvard University. Her dissertation is a classic work. Now it was republished as Under Every Green Tree, Popular Religion in 6th Century Judah. She's also been the president of the American Schools of Overseas Research until recently. She's a prolific author and has written some of the most seminal works in the field. There's really too many articles and works to mention, but let me just quickly mention a few of her books. In addition to her book, Under Every Green Tree, she wrote Warrior, Dancer, Seductress, Queen, Women in Judges in Biblical Israel, that was published by Doubleday. She wrote When Heroes Love, The Ambiguity of Eros in the Stories of Gilgamesh and David, was published by Columbia University Press. And then just recently, Gods, Goddesses, and the Women Who Serve Them, a collection of her essays in the field, published by Erdmans in 2022. Women, and just recently, Women and the Religion of Ancient Israel, sort of a magnum opus of some of your works, I think, in the Yale Reference Library in 2022. And today we're very fortunate to have some of Professor Ackerman's continuing and interesting research. Hopefully it'll be a book in the near future again. So if I can turn it over now to Professor Ackerman, we're really delighted to have you here at UCLA virtually today.
Well, thank you, Bill, and it's a pleasure to be with you virtually. As I'm speaking to you from New Hampshire, where we're under a winter weather advisory. It's snowing right now, so I wish I was with you for real, where the weather would be a little bit nicer. But let me see if I can make this technology work. Okay, I think we are good. Okay. I am working on another book. And this book is on women's life cycle rituals in ancient Israel. So I'm interested in things like women's coming of age rituals. I'm interested in rituals of betrothal, rituals that have to do with weddings. I'm interested in women's burial rituals. But right now I'm in the throes of working on rituals that surround motherhood in ancient Israel. I understand motherhood to be a multi-dimensional process for an ancient Israelite woman. So I have some studies on rituals related to pregnancy and childbirth. I have a study related on rituals related to weaning, but the paper I want to share with you today comes between childbirth and weaning, and it's about mothers and rituals of child naming in ancient Israel. So I'll just dive in. So in the Bible, sorry, we're having trouble getting the slide to advance. Oh, here we go. In the Bible, when we look at rituals of child naming, we find that fathers sometimes take responsibility for naming their children. So, for example, in the slide you're looking at here, you can see in the middle that Abraham named his son Isaac, for example, according to Genesis 21, verse 3. And sometimes parents jointly take responsibility for naming their children. So arguably, Isaac and Rebekah should be the they who named their firstborn son, Esau, in Genesis 25, verse 25. Still, it's the case somewhat more often than not that a child is given its name by its mother or by a mother's female surrogate or surrogates. And by that, I mean sometimes midwives name children on behalf of a mother, or in the slide you're looking at here, if you look at the very bottom example, you can see that Pharaoh's daughter, who is Moses' surrogate mother, names Moses on behalf of his biological mother. So more specifically, it's a child's mother or her female surrogate or surrogates who name the child in about 65% of the episodes in the Hebrew Bible where a name giver is identified. Or more specifically still, we could say that by my count, and people can quibble over some of these, but I count 46 instances in the biblical text where a child's name giver is explicitly identified. And in 29 of those 46 examples, the child's mother or her female surrogate or surrogates name the baby. This same tradition of mothers or their female surrogates conferring infants' names can also be found if we move south and west from Israel to ancient Egypt. So, for example, in one of the stories that's told in the Egyptian Westcar papyrus, which dates from the early 2nd millennium BCE, the goddess Isis, who's one of the four goddesses who serves as a midwife to a woman named Rudedit, bestows names on Rudedit's 3 children at the time of their delivery. And you can see the names, Isis speaking to bestow those names on the slide here, very analogously to the way that a midwife or some other woman attending an Israelite mother at the time of her delivery can be said to bestow an infant's name in Hebrew Bible accounts. If we move a little bit later in Egyptian history to the New Kingdom, we can find that in a New Kingdom hymn to the god Amun, we have a reference to his mother who made his name, suggesting similarly that an Egyptian child's name could be conferred by the newborn's mother or her female surrogate or surrogates, and perhaps conferred in these specially built arbors or birth huts that you're seeing a picture of here on the right-hand side of the slide, where at least in some instances, delivery in Egypt took place. You can tell it's an arbor if you look at the leaves that are coming down from the top and along the sides. Moving to the Levantine coast, the northern Levantine coast, at the late Bronze Age city-state of Ugarit. There, it's not explicitly stated who names the children of the god Ale, the children who are named Dawn and Dusk in a mythological text that's called the birth of the gracious gods. But if we look at the text, it's quite clear that this pair has already been named when word is brought to the god Ale, their father, of their birth. And named by whom? Well, again, the text doesn't tell us, but the only other characters mentioned in this part of the text are Ale's 2 wives, and the unidentified messenger who brings the news that these two children, dawn and dusk, have been delivered. It seems that either the wives or the messenger must have named the children, and I think it follows most logically that the wives would have conferred upon these two children their names when they were delivered. However, elsewhere in the ancient Near East and the wider Mediterranean, for example, in the Hittite Empire, a baby was named by its father. We're looking here at a 2nd millennium BCE Hittite text. It's from a Hurrian myth known as the Song of Uli Kumi. And there, the god Kumarbi bestows the name Uli Kumi on his son after the child has been brought to Kumarbi and set on his father's knees at some point subsequent to delivery. Likewise, in another roughly contemporary Hittite tale called Apu and his two sons, a nurse brings Apu's firstborn son to Apu after the wife has delivered the child. The nurse then sets the baby on Apu's knees, at which point Apu put, quote, a fitting name upon him. Apu likewise put the right name upon his second son when that nurse brought that baby to the father after the child had been born. Moving to classical and Hellenistic Greece, there, it was also the father who played a central role in postpartum rituals. First, the father formally accepted, or actually could reject, a newborn child, and by presumably accepting the child, marked the newborn as a member of the family, or if rejected, dismissed the newborn as a member of the family. This father's decision took place at a ceremony that's called the amphidromia. And as you can see here, it seems to be a time of great feasting in Greek tradition. It was observed on the 5th day after a child's birth, or at least according to some sources, perhaps the 7th or the 10th day. Our sources are also a little unclear, but they suggest that at the same time, or perhaps at a separate, although roughly concurrent naming ceremony, a name was bestowed upon the newborn child, again, apparently by the father. Also in Greek tradition, we have records of a joyous celebration called the Tessera Kosteion, which seems to have been held the 40th day after a mother delivered her child. More specifically, this celebration seemed to mark the end of a 40-day period during which the new mother was considered to be ritually impure. And her impurities were moreover considered to be communicable, which means that she could transfer them to other people with whom she came into contact. So that meant for the 40 days postpartum, she had to be kept isolated from those to whom she might pass her impurities, especially those beyond her household walls. And then only after the 40 days had passed could she rejoin her community at this special celebration. This new mother perhaps spent the 40 days in the part of the household's living quarters reserved exclusively for women, the gunakaon, but we're not totally sure about that. That would have been, though, the part of the household where 40 days earlier she had delivered the child. Now, these traditions in Greece about the woman bearing a child in a special or separate part of the household, and also then having a period of impurity thereafter, are well paralleled elsewhere in the ancient world. In 2nd millennium Hittite tradition, to return to the Hittite Empire, we can find similar records of birth taking place in a special and separate hut built for the delivering mother. And Hittite text also attests that there was a prolonged period after delivery, in this case 3 months if the mother was delivered of a boy child, and 4 months if the mother had been delivered of a girl child, when both the mother and the child were considered to be ritually impure. It was only when this period of impurity ended that the mother and child were able to re-enter into normal relations with the rest of their community, perhaps with a ceremony to ensure the continued fertility of the mother. Likewise, in ancient Mesopotamia, women seem to have delivered their children while isolated from the rest of their family, and a newly delivered mother was furthermore considered to be affected by a time of impurity thereafter, perhaps for 10 days, perhaps for 30 days, which required that she and her newborn child remain isolated from those to whom she might pass her pollution, especially those beyond her household walls. Then, according at least to 3rd millennium and early 2nd millennium BCE Mesopotamian texts, there was some sort of ceremony that marked the end of this period of impurity. For example, and you're seeing an example of this here, a feast at which the newly delivered mother received all kinds of presents. In New Kingdom Egypt as well, women could be separated from their households and their society at large at birth. So the delivery, as I already noted, might take place in a specially built arbor or hut outside the home. And then there followed, at least according to one Egyptian source, a 14-day period of impurity, and then a purification ceremony, and next a celebration seems to have taken place. At the latter, the mother wore festal clothes and received offerings of flowers and perfume. This is a rather crude drawing, but nevertheless one that is often suggested to represent this scene where the mother wore festal clothes shortly after her birth, after the period of impurity had ended, where she's receiving from the attendants on her left offerings of flowers and perfume. And then we can see a dance being performed, in this case, actually a dance performed by the demigod associated with childbirth in ancient Egypt, the god Bes, in the upper right-hand corner. Now, certain features of these Mesopotamian and Hittite and Egyptian and Greek parturition rituals should sound very familiar to students of the Bible and ancient Israelite tradition. For example, the Bible's birth accounts suggest that just as in Mesopotamia, the Hittite Empire, Egypt, and Greece, delivering women were separated during childbirth from everyone except their midwives or from other women who attended them. Or at least biblical tradition suggests that ancient Israelite women were separated from their husbands during birth, given that we have this verse from Jeremiah that indicates that word had to be brought after delivery to Jeremiah's father that a son had been born to him. More notably, the Bible offers a close parallel to the Mesopotamian, Hittite, Egyptian, and Greek traditions regarding a newly delivered mother's post-childbirth impurity in Leviticus chapter 12, verses 2-5. There we read that a newly delivered mother in Israel is said to manifest the same sort of ritual impurity as does a menstruant for 7 days after the birth of a son, or for 14 days after the birth of a daughter. Like a menstruant, therefore, the new mother could transmit her impurity to anyone who touched her, or anyone who touched a piece of furniture on which she had sat or lain. Factors that would have surely constrained, at least to some degree, interactions between this newly delivered mother and members of her family and others in her community. Now, the likening of a new mother to a menstruant ended after 1 or 2 weeks, and thereby relaxed the heightened restrictions that would constrain the contact this woman could have with other family and community members. But the Leviticus prohibition that keeps a newly delivered mother from touching anything classified as kodesh or holy, and from entering sanctified space persisted for another 33 days if she had given birth to a son, or 66 days if her child was a girl. So for a total of 40 days for a boy child and 80 days for a girl. But we have no indications within the Hebrew Bible that at the end of either the initial 7 or 14-day period of impurity, or the subsequent 33 or 66 days, that there was a feast for the newly delivered mother, or that gifts were given to her, or that she was otherwise the focus of the same sort of ceremonies that we saw in Mesopotamia, in Hittite tradition, in Egypt, and in Greek text. And I'd note in particular that in this passage that I'm showing you here from Leviticus, that although this passage speaks of a sacrificial offering that this recently delivered mother is required to bring to God's sanctuary, even though that marks in a certain way the end of her period of impurity, is that the new mother is now able to reinstate her relationship with God and come into sacred space. It doesn't mark her reinstated relationship within her human community the way that feasting or gift giving or community celebrations would. Yet without that sort of ceremony, or without feasting, or without a gift-giving celebration at the end of the period of impurity, how is an Israelite woman's new infant introduced to her larger community? And and how is the woman's new maternal identity registered? What I want to suggest is that this is accomplished through the mother bestowing on her new infant a name. More specifically, by bestowing her child's name, the new mother indicates that at that moment, she has, in the words of Della Pollock, who's a specialist in cultural studies, brought her newborn over the last threshold of nothingness into being. And that she thereby delivers her infant into membership with at least her household and her family. Simultaneously, the new mother, especially a mother who's given birth for the first time, reestablishes her membership within her family and household, but now with a new role and a new station in life as a child bearer. And I think it's striking and in stark contrast to the Mesopotamian, Hittite, Egyptian, and Greek ceremonies, feast, and other gift-giving celebrations at which the mother's new status and position is marked. In Israel, the mother is the subject of the name-giving act that asserts her new identity. Whereas in Mesopotamia, the Hittite Empire, Egypt, and Greece, women are the objects of their community's ritual activities. Name giving is thus the means by which a new Israelite mother not only claims, but also proclaims her new life station. And note indeed the proclaims. For what is often the case, that the names that Israelite mothers or their female surrogate or surrogates bestow upon a newborn child reflect on circumstances that pertain explicitly to the woman's maternal identity. For example, the woman's experiences during pregnancy and childbirth, or other matters related to a child's delivery. Even more so do we see this in the so-called naming speeches that are frequently found with maternal name-giving accounts in the Bible. Or to put the matter another way, when bestowing a name, and especially when supplementing the name giving with a speech that explains the name's meaning, mothers or her female surrogates often tell us something about the mother's perception of and reactions to the childbirth process and or other matters related to her maternity. For example, if you look at the slide you're seeing here, according to what I at least would take to be the most plausible translation of Genesis chapter 4, verse 1, Adam and Eve's firstborn son, Cain, is so named because I created him. Eve puns, playing on the assonance of the name Cain, and the verb kaniti, I created. I created a man, she continues, with Yahweh, or with the God of Israel. At one level, we can take this account of creating Cain with Yahweh as an acknowledgement of Yahweh's often attested role in biblical tradition as a giver of children. Still, I think it's of note that Eve stresses through her naming of Cain, her own experience of becoming pregnant and delivering a child. I created him, she says. Each of the names that Leah and Rachel gives Jacob's 12 sons is likewise reminiscent of and explained by some aspect of the two women's experiences in childbearing, or especially for Leah, the relation between her childbearing and her marriage to Jacob. So for example, in the middle example that you're looking at here, Leah in Genesis 29, verse 32, names her firstborn son Reuben, meaning look, a son, because she says his birth shows that Yahweh has seen, that she is unloved by Jacob and has compensated her with a bane, a son, a baby boy. Likewise, in Genesis 29:33, Leah confers the name Shimeon, on her second son, whom Yahweh, she says, has given her because the deity heard, Shema, that she was hated and wanted to offer redress. Rachel, similarly, in the example you're seeing at the bottom of the slide here, names her firstborn son Joseph, Yosef, in the hopes that Yahweh will add Yosef, another son, to her progeny after a prolonged stint of barrenness during which Leah has given birth 7 times over. Rachel also bestows the name because under the terms of a much less convincing etymology, God has gathered, presumably in the sense of gathered up and bundled away. The verb is asaf, my reproach, she says. Overall, by my count, 19 out of the Bible's 29 accounts of a mother or her female surrogates bestowing a name on a child, that's about 65%, include a naming speech describing aspects of the woman's pregnancy and delivery that the child's name commemorates, or the speeches describe related circumstances that pertain to the maternal experience. Conversely, only 6 of the 17 instances where a father bestows a name include a naming speech. That's about 35%. So 2/3 for women, 1/3 for men. And moreover, the content of women's and men's naming speeches differs. Again, women's naming speeches address again and again the mother's experiences during pregnancy and childbirth or circumstances otherwise related to her maternal experience. Fathers' naming speeches tend to reflect on the father's life in general. Moses, for example, names his son Gershom, for example, because the name expresses Moses' experience as a stranger or a ger in a foreign land. Joseph names his firstborn son Manasseh because God has made him forget, Nasa, all of his troubles, by which Joseph seems to mean his fraught relations that have gone on for his entire life with his 10 half-brothers. Finally, it's worth noting how often mothers' naming speeches reflect not just on the specific events related with their pregnancies and deliveries, but also reference the role of God in their experience of childbearing. I've already cited several examples, and I just show you those again here. Eve naming Cain, Leah naming Reuben, Rachel naming Joseph. All of those cite God. But religious discourse is not something women in the Bible get to do very often. They don't get to give voice very often to their religious self-expression. And religious naming speeches thus bear important witness, I think, to women's reflections on their religious experiences and their engagement with Yahweh, the Israelite God. So overall, what I'd like to propose is that the ritual of mothers naming their children in ancient Israel performs an analogous role to the ritual celebrations that mark a mother's reentry into her community in Mesopotamia, in Hittite culture, in Egyptian, and in Greek traditions, and perhaps even a more powerful role. By marking a newly delivered mother's reintroduction of herself and her introduction of her newborn into her family and household, by marking a newly delivered mother's status as a childbearer, and so allowing her to claim, and even more so to proclaim for herself a new role and a new station in life, and by allowing new mothers an important opportunity for religious self-expression. The conclusion that follows, at least for me then, is that for ancient Israelite women, the responsibility of name giving that women somewhat more often than not assumed within their communities should be understood as a meaningful and multi-dimensional ritual act. Thank you. We'll stop sharing.
Thank you, Professor Ackerman. That was absolutely delightful.
Well, thank you.
And it raises so many interesting questions. Maybe I will start with asking you to reflect on this research in terms of the whole trajectory of your research and career. I mean, you just finished a book on ancient Israelite religion in ancient Israel, for women's religion in ancient Israel. What sparked your interest in this particular topic of women's lives? The one thing that really strikes me is this is so new. I mean, so much of what we do, we're just rehashing or arguing about what other people have said. And what I see here, and maybe in the trajectory, is stuff that people have never really written about.
Well, thank you. In terms of long-term trajectory, you mentioned my dissertation, which has, I always think my work tends to have good titles and it goes downhill from there, but my dissertation has what I think is a great title, which is Under Every Green Tree. And it takes it from those verses in the Bible that talk about activities that the Israelites were said to engage in on, quote, every high hill and under every green tree that the biblical writers don't approve of. And that's key to the trajectory. Is I have been interested since I was a graduate student in things the biblical writers either don't approve of or that they don't pay much attention to. So I have written about rituals of child sacrifice. I've written about rituals of goddess worship. I've written about rituals of dream incubation. And my interest in women is really an interest in writing about a group that the biblical writers aren't very interested in. And that's been a long-term interest. This particular project is an offshoot of the book that I just published on women and the religion of ancient Israel. That book has a section in it that I called Where, the calendar of ancient Israelite women's religious lives. And originally I had envisioned that section as having two major components, one on the ritual calendar of the ancient Israelite week, month, and year. So women's engagement in Shabbat or Sabbath rituals, women's engagement in rituals of the new moon, women's engagement in rituals like Passover or Shavuot or Sukkot. And then I had envisioned as the other main section of that to talk about women's rituals in the when of the life cycle. So from birth to death. And Bill, as you well know, while that may have been my vision, publishers tend to want your books to be shorter, and they wanted me to cut words. And so one of the ways I decided I could cut words is cut out the whole project on women's life cycle rituals and turn that into a separate book. And that's the little snippet that you heard today comes from that.
Oh, that's great. So we will look forward to the book as well. One of the questions that comes to mind in different directions, but is the methodology that you're using. You're using a comparative method, drawing parallels from Egypt, Mesopotamia, Ugarit, the Hittites. It's a very interesting method. There are a number of questions and results of the methodology. I mean, one is some uniqueness about ancient Israelite naming practices in comparison with other Near Eastern cultures. Another is, issues of, dating come to my mind. You're talking about ritual practices in these cultures that are mostly second and early first millennium, as opposed to, let's say, late first millennium, that is Persian and Roman Hellenistic. I recall, for example, a famous naming incident in the New Testament in the Roman period, right, where some certain guy named Joseph, his wife gives birth, and he names his son Jesus. I'm wondering if naming practices change over time as well. So is that something that played into your study? Did you think about later naming practices in Jewish tradition as opposed to earlier periods of time?
I have, and they do change, and they change in some interesting ways. And I guess I would say one way in which they change is when later Jewish writers retell older Hebrew Bible traditions. So, for example, if you look at the later Jewish text of the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, which goes back and looks at the story of the 12 sons of Jacob in Genesis, when in the Testament of the 12 Patriarchs, when you get the naming stories, it will often shift and take away the mother's agency in naming and assign it to the father.
Oh, interesting.
It'll shift the story. And somewhat you also cited in the New Testament, obviously, that Joseph is the one who names Jesus. My own sense is that this may be under influence of Greek tradition. So as I mentioned to you, or as mentioned in my talk, in Greek tradition, and here we do know this from the classical and the Hellenistic period, so we know this more from, let's say, the 5th, the 4th, the 3rd, the 2nd century BCE, that fathers were responsible for naming their children. So my own sense is that as Hellenistic influence came into Syria, Palestine, and began to influence Jewish tradition, as we know, for example, most famously from the story of the Maccabees, that as we begin to see that Hellenistic influence, one of the things we may see is the way that naming traditions shift from mother naming to father naming. It's also interesting in that regard that Roman tradition may come to influence this a little bit as well. So in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus is not named until the 8th day after his birth. The parallel for that comes from ancient Rome, where male children are named on the 8th day after their birth and female children are named on the 9th day after their birth. And so Luke may be reflecting there his larger, not citizenship, but his larger context of living within the world of the Roman Empire and Roman tradition about naming.
Oh, interesting. Well, in terms of comparative material, I mean, I'm interested in the dating also, because you're drawing so heavily on, Hittite Mesopotamia, Egyptian parallels from, the first millennium. What does it say about the dating of these biblical texts? You're assuming that the context of it is not a later Persian Hellenistic context, but a second millennium, first millennium, early first millennium context.
I am a more, I would say traditional, you could say conservative dater of the biblical text. I tend to think that there are significant portions of the biblical material, both materials that show up in the Torah and the Pentateuch, materials that show up in the so-called Deuteronomistic history or in the Jewish former prophets. I tend to think that I would date those materials to a pre-exilic date, or archaeologically to an Iron Age date. So I would tend to date them earlier in the first millennium. Now, I fully admit that doesn't get me back to being contemporaneous with the early second millennium Hittite materials I cited, or with even the late third millennium Mesopotamian materials I cited, and that's a fair criticism of my methodology. But I suppose I would say, somewhat in my defense, is it's not just the biblical writers who tended to ignore women's lives, and especially women's ritual and religious lives. It's also Egyptian writers, and it's also Mesopotamian writers, and it's also Hittite writers, and it's also Greek writers. Right. And so you got to take what you can get, and what I've given you is what I got.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting topic. I'm also taking up this problem in my new book on scribal communities, but we won't go into that. talk about it in another day. But one of the things that really struck me, and it's kind of contemporary because I'm teaching Ugaritic right now, and so I was very struck by your Ugaritic parallel for a variety of different reasons. It's partly because of a topic you've worked on before, which is queen mothers. I mean, this last week in my Ugaritic class, I said, okay, let's just read all the letters that are related to the queen mother in Ugarit. And when you go through the entire corpus, you realize that about 50% of the letters where we can identify who's writing or receiving them are related to a queen or a queen mother, which is just a striking, significance. And it actually parallels nicely with the understated but pretty significant role of queen mothers in ancient Israel. And one of the things that was really striking here is that that Israel seems to be different from its contemporaries in the primary role that women have in naming their children. Do you have reflections on, is this a Canaanite thing that's going on, Levantine, or is this somehow related to the kind of social structures and society of ancient Israel? Have you any thoughts about some of the difference and where it arises from?
No, or I can only make the observation for you that it's true. And the parallel observation I tried to draw in my talk is what Israel is missing are these post-childbirth feasting, gift-giving celebrations. And again, the suggestion I tried to make that name giving somehow substitutes for that. I do think it may have something to do with the deeply embedded kinship structures that I'm about to say structures that structure, that's a terrible sentence, but the deeply embedded systems of kinship that structure Israelite society, at least according to many theorists, from the very most fundamental household all the way up to the royal palace and to the way that the king is perceived within the society and the way that God is perceived in terms of a sort of kinship relationship within the Israelites. I do think that it may be that this intensely kinship, these intense kinship systems may make naming particularly important, and particularly important for introducing new membership into that household. It is interesting to me. I know I gave you a lot of examples from Genesis because people know them and they're easy to pull out, but these traditions of mothers naming their children can be found across biblical sources. They can be found in Genesis, they can be found in Exodus, they're found in Samuel, they're found in I should do it in order. They're found in Judges, they're found in Samuel, they're found in Chronicles, arguably in some prophetic literature. So it does seem to be something that spans the spectrum of the biblical sources. So it's not just one particular segment of the biblical writers, and thus not one particular segment of Israelite society, I think, where this happens.
Well, one of the things that's interesting to me that I'm working on now myself is the way women's voices in the Hebrew Bible seem to be more prominent in the Iron Age and seem to be suppressed to some extent in the later editing and redaction of the Bible in later periods. I'm sort of reflecting on this. I'm just going back to the queen mothers. One of the things that strikes me about Ugarit was that in a lot of those letters, it looks like the queen mother is more important than the king. So in other words, the king will write to the queen mother and say, my mother, at your feet I fall 7 and 7 times.
7 times, yes, exactly.
Yeah, and in ancient Israel, the queen mother seems to have also a significant role in ancient Israel, and she's preserved in the accession formula. Occasionally, stories are there where it seems that she's a lot more prominent than we get the impression. But then in the reception of it, it seems to get the role seems to get muted. And I was wondering if this is a problem that you're facing it with you know, I should say I learned something new. This word parutition, right? Parturition. This is my new word for the day. The action of giving birth, right?
Right.
Is this something that
the parturient is the woman who gives birth, and the act is parturition. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd never seen this word before, so I'm like learning many different things today. But is this a problem that you're dealing with, and how do you address this issue when you're dealing with biblical sources?
Well, I'm again someone who not only tends to be more traditionalist in terms of dating a lot of biblical sources earlier than many scholars would today. But I'm also someone who spends most of my time in what I think are those earlier sources. I very much think of myself as someone who works primarily in so-called pre-exilic material, before 586 and the Babylonian exile, and then just in the very, very early post-exilic period. I would say generally, I agree with, and this is hardly unique to me, but I agree with those scholars who have suggested that things like centralization, things like more and more complex bureaucracies, things like more and more institutionalization, these things are not particularly good for women being able to find avenues for expression in political, economic, juridical, religious, social life generally. So, for example, if we agree with the biblical account, and I in many ways do, as we move towards the end of the pre-exilic period, and we see efforts towards centralizing worship in Jerusalem, and certainly as we move into the post-exilic period, where we seem to see that far more predominantly of the centralization of worship at the Jerusalem temple, that's not good for women. It's not good for women's religious self-expression. Centralization, and then all the bureaucracy and institutionalization of an all-male priesthood that goes with that, that's not good for women.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the interesting differences between ancient Israel and its surrounding cultures, right? There are no women priests. And yes. What is the impact of that, especially if the reception and the final editing is certainly of the Bible is in a priestly context. I mean, not the original composition of the Bible, but certainly its reception and editing is in that context, and that has and this is a way that Israel is unique. It doesn't have women priests.
I mean, as I know you know this because you've seen this work of mine.
It's an important.
One of the things I've tried to suggest is Israel is also the only culture in the ancient world where you can find good, solid evidence of a tradition of menstrual impurity and not just childbirth impurity. I talked about childbirth impurity this afternoon or tonight, but menstrual impurity, you can only find good evidence for it in Israel. And what does impurity mean? Impurity means that you have to be separated from sacred space. So if you have a culture that has a tradition of menstrual impurity, and again, Israel's the only one I could tell you from the ancient world that I think that's really demonstrably present. If you have a tradition of impurity for menstrual impurity, you're basically saying that women of childbearing age are precluded from service in sacred space for major parts of their reproductive years. So if you're precluded from service in sacred space, you can't be a priestess.
Right. Of course, this comes to a related question that's a big bugaboo of biblical studies, which is, how do we date the priestly literature that talks about this material? And I'm in I would say the minority. It's not a small minority of people who think that the priestly literature is not purely post-exilic or exilic and post-exilic. I think that it dates also into the early First Temple period. But I mean, is that, those prescriptions, are those prescriptions a reflection of later Jewish practice in the Second Temple period as opposed to the First Temple period?
Yeah, well, and in this case, I would say it's important to remember that although we don't get prescriptions about menstrual impurity, we get a story in Genesis about Rachel, is that Laban cannot approach her when she's sitting on the camel seat because she is in the way of women, right? So there's a tradition of ritual impurity that is in the JE epic Pentateuchal sources, which again, I would be very happy to put in the pre-exilic period. I would say that Bathsheba bathing herself when David sees her from his rooftop, that's also that she's said to be purifying herself. What's she purifying herself from? I think most logically, she's purifying herself from menstrual impurity. Ezekiel and Lamentations, so that puts you at least still, it's late pre-exilic, but you're in the pre-exilic period, both speak of menstrual impurity. As does the Holiness Code. So there's another. So it's not just that you have to look at the priestly material shows up in Leviticus 15. Again, it's a pretty widespread tradition in Israel in narrative sources, in legal sources, in prophetic sources.
Well, thank you so much. I think we've covered a lot of bases today. I mean, there's so many more questions. I'm very interested in the last part. You were talking about the punning on names and the differences between men's punning, or what I would call folk etymologies that seem to be part of naming practice. Is that something, these kind of punning and folk etymologies, that's unique to ancient Israel, or comparatively is similar things being done in Egypt and Mesopotamia?
No, it's. I have tried to find those parallels, and it's really hard to find. So, for example, I have found one naming speech by a woman, period paragraph, from anywhere else in the ancient world. It comes from Egyptian tradition. I have to read it to you because I don't have it memorized. But it is a tradition about a woman who finds an abandoned child, and the child is given a name, which means I found her on the west bank of the Nile. Well, that's a name, and it has an etymology to it, but it's not. It sure isn't, I created him with the help of the Lord or whatever, right? It doesn't have nearly that resonance that Hebrew naming speeches have.
No, it's interesting that we talk about etymology in these naming practices, but most of these people who are doing these naming practices probably hadn't taken Frank Moore Cross's historical Hebrew grammar. So a soft to gather and soft to add, did they really recognize these as etymologically different? They sounded the same. They probably contextually, and it's wonderful. You're getting the same kind of play that becomes part of Jewish interpretive tradition. It's part of the naming practices as well. You see it already. It's really
So I was once leading a tour group of Dartmouth alumni in Israel. And we had an Israeli tour guide who was our assigned tour guide. I was just the, icing on the cake lecturer who was along. But we were driving in the Galilee, and we drove by a moshav, and our tour guide pointed it out and said that's a moshav, and he explained what a moshav was in terms of social organization, you know, in Israel, and sort of like not quite a kibbutz, but some of the same practices. And I said, yeah, it's an intentional community that has intentionally chosen to dwell together. It comes from the root yashav, to dwell. And the tour guide said, no, it doesn't. Like, of course it does. And what is so striking is, like, here's this modern Hebrew speaker. He doesn't think about etymologies. He doesn't think about how these things work in the way that I, who am so immersed in thinking and trained that way, can't help but think that.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
So,
well, thank you so much, Professor Ackerman. This has been a delightful lecture and discussion, and I could go on forever, but we need to wrap it up at some point. And but thank you for being with us today. It's been wonderful.
well, thank you so much for having me, and I'll hope to come see you in person someday.